A millionaire was walking through the city and saw two twins begging at the traffic light. But when he opened the car door, he was shocked to discover what they were capable of. Subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting stories like this one. The bitter February wind whipped through the narrow streets of London's East End, carrying with it the promise of another freezing night. Oliver and Arthur Hughes huddled together in the doorway of an abandoned shop, their thin jackets offering little protection against the relentless cold. At 14, the twin brothers had already mastered the art of survival on London's unforgiving streets, their matching blue eyes holding a wisdom far beyond their years. "Come on, Ollie," Arthur whispered, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "The morning rush will start soon. We need to get to our spot before someone else takes it." He pulled his worn beanie lower over his ears, his blonde hair identical to his brother's, peeking out from underneath. Oliver nodded, gathering their few possessions, a backpack containing 2 threadbare blankets, a couple of water bottles, and their prized possession, a photo of their grandmother, the last reminder of a time when they had a home. 6 months had passed since they had to leave the foster care system, unwilling to be separated when their last foster family could only take one of them. The twins made their way through the awakening city, their feet carrying them automatically to their usual intersection near Canary Wharf, where suited professionals in expensive cars would soon begin their daily commute. They had claimed this spot 3 months ago, and the regular stream of traffic had proven profitable enough to keep them fed, if nothing else. "I've got a good feeling about today," Oliver said, trying to inject some optimism into their morning routine. He pulled out their squeegees and bucket, filling it with water from a nearby tap. The winter sun was just beginning to peek through the buildings, casting long shadows across the street. Arthur managed a small smile. "You say that every day, Ollie. And one day I'll be right." Their work began as the traffic started to build. The brothers had developed a system. Oliver would approach the cars while Arthur kept watch for any trouble. They had learned early on that working together was safer than splitting up, even if it meant earning less. The morning progressed slowly, with most drivers waving them away or pretending they didn't exist. A few kind souls handed them loose change or the occasional pound coin, which they carefully stored in their jacket pockets. By mid-morning, they had earned enough for a modest breakfast from the local cafe that didn't mind serving street kids. As they worked, they couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between their world and the one that surrounded them. Through the windows of the gleaming office buildings, they could see people in smart suits attending meetings, typing at computers, living lives so different from their own that they might as well have been on another planet. "Do you ever wonder what it's like?" Arthur asked during a lull in traffic, gesturing toward the towering glass buildings. "To have a proper job, a proper life." Oliver squeezed out his squeegee, watching the dirty water run into the gutter. "Sometimes. But what's the point? People like us don't get those chances." "Gran always said we could be anything we wanted to be," Arthur reminded him, his voice soft with memory. "Gran's gone," Oliver replied, more sharply than he intended. Seeing the hurt in his brother's eyes, he quickly added, "But maybe she was right. Maybe we just haven't found our chance yet." The twins had developed a sixth sense for trouble during their time on the streets, learning to read people and situations with uncanny accuracy, but nothing had prepared them for the black Range Rover that pulled up to the traffic light just before noon. The window rolled down, and instead of the usual dismissive wave, they found themselves looking into the kind eyes of a man in his early 40s, wearing an expertly tailored suit that spoke of wealth and success. "Would you boys like to earn a proper wage for your work?" the man asked, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed genuine. "I own several office buildings in the area, and I could use some help with the windows." The twins exchanged glances, their street-honed instincts warring with the desperate hope that this might be the chance they'd been waiting for. They had learned to be wary of strangers offering help, but something about this man felt different. "I'm James Bennett," the man continued, sensing their hesitation. "I started out not much different from you two. What do you say we discuss it over lunch?" "My treat, of course." Before either twin could respond, the light turned green and cars behind the Range Rover began to honk impatiently. "I'll be back in an hour," James called out as he drove away, leaving Oliver and Arthur standing on their corner, wondering if they had just imagined the entire encounter. "What do you think?" Arthur asked, watching the Range Rover disappear around the corner. Oliver gripped his squeegee tighter, his mind racing with possibilities. I think Gran would say this might be our chance. They continued their work, but now with an eye on the clock, both brothers secretly hoping that James Bennett would keep his promise and return. Their grandmother's words echoed in their minds. Opportunity knocks softly, boys. You have to be listening carefully to hear it. As the hour drew to a close, they found themselves watching every black car that approached, their hearts beating a little faster each time. The winter sun had climbed higher in the sky, but the chill in the air remained, reminding them of the reality of another night on the streets if this opportunity proved false. Yet something about James Bennett's eyes had sparked a feeling they hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. And for two boys who had learned to survive on nothing but their wits and each other, hope was a dangerous but irresistible currency. True to his word, James Bennett's Range Rover appeared exactly 1 hour later. This time he pulled into a nearby parking space rather than stopping at the traffic light. The twins watched as he stepped out of the vehicle, his presence commanding yet somehow approachable. In the daylight, they could see the silver threading through his dark hair and the laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of a man who smiled often. "I was hoping you boys would still be here," James said, approaching them with careful steps, as if trying not to startle a pair of wild animals. "There's a nice cafe around the corner that serves the best shepherd's pie in London. What do you say?" Oliver and Arthur exchanged glances, having one of those silent conversations that only twins can manage. After a moment, Arthur spoke up. "Why are you helping us?" James's expression softened, and for a moment a shadow of old pain crossed his face. "Because 30 years ago, I was standing exactly where you are now. Well, not exactly here. I was in Manchester, but the circumstances were similar." He gestured to their squeegees. "Except I used to sell newspapers instead of cleaning windows." The twins gathered their few belongings, still cautious but intrigued. James led them to a cozy cafe tucked away on a side street, the kind of place that seemed to exist in a different world from their usual haunts. The hostess's eyes widened slightly at their appearance, but James's presence seemed to smooth over any concerns. Once seated in a quiet corner booth, James ordered 3 shepherd's pies and hot chocolate for all of them. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I'm James Bennett, founder and CEO of Bennett Property Development." "And you are?" "I'm Arthur," the slightly taller twin replied, "and this is my brother Oliver." "Hughes," Oliver added, lifting his chin slightly. "We're the Hughes twins." James nodded, treating this information with the seriousness it deserved. Hughes. Good, strong name. "And how long have you been on your own?" The hot chocolates arrived, topped with whipped cream and chocolate shavings. Arthur wrapped his cold hands around the warm mug, savoring the heat. 6 months, give or take. "And before that?" "Foster care," Oliver said shortly, his tone suggesting he didn't want to elaborate. James didn't push. Instead, he shared his own story as they ate. He told them about growing up in Manchester's roughest council estate, about losing his parents young and ending up on the streets. He spoke about the man who had given him a chance, Mr. Richardson, a local builder who had seen potential in the scrappy teenager selling papers on his corner. "Mr. Richardson taught me everything he knew about property development," James explained, watching as the twins devoured their shepherd's pies. "He helped me get my education, gave me my first job, and eventually helped me start my own company. Now, Bennett Property Development owns buildings across the UK. And you want to help us?" Arthur asked, skepticism clear in his voice. "Just like that?" "Just like that," James confirmed. "Though it's not entirely altruistic. I've been looking for ways to give back, to honor Mr. Richardson's memory. When I saw you two this morning, it felt like fate." Oliver, who had been quiet throughout most of the meal, finally spoke up. "What exactly are you offering?" James set down his fork and looked at them both seriously. "To start with, a job. Legal, properly paid work cleaning windows at my properties. But more than that, I'm offering you a chance at a different life. Education if you want it, a roof over your heads, a future." The twins sat in stunned silence, the remainder of their shepherd's pies forgotten. It seemed too good to be true, and on the streets things that seemed too good to be true usually were. "There's a catch, right?" Oliver asked, his voice hard with suspicion. "There's always a catch." James shook his head. "No catch, though I should mention that I'm married. My wife, Victoria, comes from a very different background than I do. She might take some time to adjust to the idea, but my home is large enough for two more, and I believe everyone deserves a second chance. Why should we trust you? Arthur asked, though his voice held more hope than suspicion. James reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, removing a worn photograph. He placed it on the table between them. The photo showed a teenage boy in ragged clothes selling newspapers on a street corner. Because I've been where you are, and I know what it's like to be offered a lifeline when you're drowning. The twins studied the photo, then looked at each other. Years of living on the streets had taught them to read people, to spot lies and manipulation. But everything about James Bennet rang true, from the slight northern accent that crept into his voice when he spoke about Manchester, to the genuine emotion in his eyes when he mentioned Mr. Richardson. "We need time to think about it," Oliver said finally. James nodded, understanding their caution. He pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. "This is my personal mobile number. The address of my main office is on the front. Think it over, discuss it between yourselves. If you decide to accept my offer, come to the office tomorrow morning. If not," he shrugged. "No pressure, no obligations." As they left the cafe, James handed each boy an envelope. "A day's wages for the windows you've already cleaned. Whether you come tomorrow or not, this is yours." The twins watched as James's Range Rover disappeared into the London traffic. They opened the envelopes to find £50 each, more money than they typically made in a week. "What do you think, Ollie?" Arthur asked, still staring at the money in his hands. Oliver clutched the business card, his thumb running over the embossed lettering. I think Gran would say we'd be fools not to at least try." They spent the rest of the afternoon in their usual spot, but their hearts weren't in the window cleaning anymore. Their minds were too full of possibilities, of hopes they had long since learned to suppress. As the winter sun began to set, they found themselves looking at the business card again and again, wondering if perhaps their grandmother had been right all along. Maybe their chance had finally come knocking. Victoria Bennet stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Chelsea townhouse, absently twisting her pearl necklace as she watched her husband's Range Rover pull into the driveway. The house, like everything in Victoria's life, was immaculate, a showcase of refined taste and privileged upbringing. At 42, she had perfected the art of maintaining appearances, from her expertly highlighted blonde hair to her carefully curated social circle. The sound of James's key in the door drew her attention away from the window. She could tell by his footsteps that he was excited about something, and that always made her nervous. James's enthusiasm usually meant changes, and Victoria despised changes to her carefully ordered world. "Victoria, darling," James called out, his voice carrying through the house. "We need to talk." She found him in his study, already loosening his tie. The smile on his face confirmed her suspicions. He had one of his ideas. "What is it, James?" she asked, perching herself on the edge of his antique desk. "I met two boys today," he began, and Victoria's heart sank. She knew that tone. It was the same tone he'd used when he announced he was starting a charitable foundation, or when he decided to mentor underprivileged youth. "Twin brothers, 14 years old, living on the streets." "James," she interrupted, "please tell me this isn't going where I think it is." But James continued as if he hadn't heard her. "They remind me so much of myself at that age. Clever, resourceful, just needing a chance. I've offered them jobs and, Victoria prompted, though she already knew what was coming. "And I want to bring them home. To live here. With us." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stood up, her perfectly manicured hands smoothing down her designer dress, a nervous habit she'd never quite overcome. "Have you lost your mind?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Bring street children into our home. They're not just street children, Victoria. They're boys who need help, just like I once was." "That was different," she protested. "You were different." James's expression hardened slightly. "How was it different? Because you didn't know me then? Because you only met me after I'd become successful?" Victoria turned away, unable to meet his eyes. "You know that's not what I mean. But we have a position to maintain. What will people think? What will my friends say?" "Your friends?" James's voice held a note of incredulity. "The same friends who whispered behind your back when you married me, because I came from nothing. The ones who still make snide comments about my humble beginnings at your charity functions." "That's not fair," Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. She knew there was truth in his words, had heard the whispers herself over the years. Despite James's success, despite his wealth and influence, certain circles of London society had never fully accepted him, or her choice to marry him. James stood and crossed the room to her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "Love, I know this is sudden. I know it's asking a lot. But these boys, Oliver and Arthur, they have so much potential. They just need a chance, like Mr. Richardson gave me. It's different having charity cases in your office versus in our home," Victoria argued, though with less force than before. She could feel her resolve weakening under her husband's earnest gaze. "They're not charity cases," James said firmly. "They're children who need help. And we have the means to help them." Victoria moved away from his touch, walking back to the window. The street outside was quiet, exclusive, the kind of neighborhood where people paid millions for the privilege of privacy and security. What if they steal from us? What if they're dangerous? James couldn't help but laugh, though there was a touch of sadness in it. They're 14-year-old boys who spend their days cleaning car windows to survive. The only danger they pose is to your social calendar. That's not funny, James. But a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth despite her best efforts. "They'll be here tomorrow," James said softly. "I've offered them jobs at the company, starting in the window cleaning crew. If they accept, and I believe they will, I want to offer them more. A home, education, a future." Victoria turned to face him, her expression troubled. "You're going to do this with or without my blessing, aren't you?" "I have to," he replied simply. "Because 30 years ago someone did the same for me. And every day I thank God that Mr. Richardson didn't let his wife's initial reluctance stop him from helping me." The implication of his words hung heavy in the air between them. Victoria knew the story of Mr. Richardson and his wife, who had eventually become like a mother to James. She had heard countless times how Mrs. Richardson's initial resistance had transformed into fierce protective love for the boy her husband had brought home. "I'm not saying no," Victoria said finally, "but I need time. Time to adjust, to prepare. You can't just spring this on me and expect immediate acceptance." James crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "That's all I'm asking for. A chance. For them and for you to see them as I do." Victoria rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "When will they arrive tomorrow?" "Early morning, if they accept the offer. I've given them my card and the office address. I suppose I should have Martha prepare the guest rooms," Victoria said, her tone resigned but not unkind. James kissed the top of her head. "Thank you, love. I promise you won't regret this." But as Victoria left the study to speak with their housekeeper, she couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully ordered world was about to be turned upside down. She touched her pearl necklace again, a family heirloom that had been passed down through generations of her family, representing everything she had been raised to value: tradition, propriety, stability. She only hoped James knew what he was doing, bringing these street boys into their home. Because if he was wrong about them, they stood to lose far more than just their reputation in society. The Bennett Property Development headquarters stood like a gleaming monument to success, its glass facade reflecting the early morning sun. Oliver and Arthur Hughes stood across the street, their worn backpack containing everything they owned clutched between them, trying to gather the courage to cross the threshold into a world so different from their own. "Maybe this is a mistake," Oliver muttered, pulling nervously at the cleanest shirt they owned, which wasn't saying much. They had spent their last few pounds at a launderette the previous evening, trying to make themselves presentable. Arthur gripped his brother's shoulder. "We agreed, Ollie. We have to try for Gran if nothing else." They had spent the previous night huddled in their usual doorway, discussing James's offer until the early hours of the morning. The £50 he had given them remained untouched in their pocket, a test they had set for themselves. If they could resist spending it on a warm bed for the night, perhaps they were ready for the responsibility of a real job. Taking a deep breath, they crossed the street together. The security guard at the front desk eyed them suspiciously as they entered the lobby. But before he could say anything, a familiar voice called out, "Oliver, Arthur, right on time!" James Bennett strode across the marble lobby, his genuine smile putting them instantly at ease. He nodded to the security guard. "It's all right, George, these young men are with me." James led them to the elevator, using his key card to access the executive floor. "First things first," he said as they ascended. "We need to get you properly set up. I hope you don't mind, but I've arranged for a full day of preparations." The twins exchanged glances but remained silent, taking in their surroundings with wide eyes. The elevator opened directly into a plush reception area where a kind-faced woman in her 50s sat behind a desk. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," she said warmly, then turned her gentle smile to the boys. "And you must be Oliver and Arthur. I'm Mrs. Parker, Mr. Bennett's executive assistant." "Mrs. Parker has been with me since I started the company," James explained. "She's arranged everything for today. First stop is the company doctor for your checkups. Then we'll get you some proper work clothes and equipment." "Doctor?" Oliver asked, tension evident in his voice. James's expression softened. "Standard company procedure for all employees. Nothing to worry about. Doctor. Stevens is very discreet and understanding. We just need to make sure you're healthy and get you up to date on any vaccinations you might have missed." The morning passed in a whirlwind of activity, Doctor. Stevens, a grandfatherly man with thick glasses and a gentle manner, gave them both thorough checkups, noting their slight undernourishment but otherwise clean bills of health. He arranged for a series of vaccinations to be completed over the next few weeks. Next came the outfitting. James took them to a nearby department store where they were measured for proper work uniforms. Heavy-duty boots, warm waterproof jackets, thick trousers, and several sets of company-branded polo shirts. The twins stood awkwardly as the salespeople fussed over them, unused to such attention. "You'll need casual clothes too," James said, adding jeans, jumpers, and other necessities to the growing pile. When Oliver started to protest about the cost, James waved him off. "Consider it your signing bonus. Every employee gets one." By lunchtime, the twins had been transformed. Dressed in their new work uniforms, they looked like proper employees rather than street kids. James took them to the company cafeteria, where they met Mike Johnson, the head of the cleaning crew. "Right then, lads," Mike said, his Cockney accent thick and friendly. "We'll start you off with the basics. Ground floor windows working in pairs. You've already got experience, which is good, but we'll teach you the proper techniques and safety procedures." As they ate lunch, proper hot meals that made their mouths water, Mike explained the schedule. They would work Monday to Friday, 8-hour shifts with proper breaks. The pay was well above minimum wage with health benefits and, most importantly, steady employment. "There's just one more thing," James said as lunch was wrapping up. He pulled out 2 envelopes and handed them to the twins. "Your contracts and something else I think you'll need." Inside each envelope was an employment contract and a brand new mobile phone. "These are company phones," James explained. "They have my number, Mrs. Parker's, Mike's, and the company security office programmed in. Keep them with you at all times." The twins stared at the phones in disbelief. They hadn't owned phones since leaving their last foster home, when they'd had to sell them for food money. "Now," James continued, his tone becoming more serious, "about living arrangements. I meant what I said yesterday about offering you a place to stay." Oliver and Arthur tensed slightly, their new phones clutched tightly in their hands. "My wife, Victoria, has agreed to give it a try," James said carefully. "I won't pretend it will be easy. She comes from a very different world than we do, but she's willing to open our home to you, and that's a start." "What if it doesn't work out?" Arthur asked, voicing the fear they both shared. "Then we'll find another solution," James assured them. "The jobs are yours regardless of where you live. But I'm asking you to give it a chance. Give her a chance." The twins looked at each other, having another of their silent conversations. Finally, Oliver spoke. "We'll try, but—" He hesitated, then continued, "We stay together, no matter what." "No matter what," James agreed solemnly. "Now Mike will show you the ropes this afternoon, and then we'll head home. Victoria's having the housekeeper prepare rooms for you." As Mike led them away to begin their training, the twins couldn't help but feel as though they were walking in a dream. Just yesterday they had been cleaning windscreens at traffic lights, wondering where their next meal would come from. Now they had jobs, new clothes, phones, and the promise of a real bed to sleep in. "Pinch me," Arthur whispered to Oliver as they followed Mike to the supply room. Oliver smiled, his first genuine smile in what felt like forever. "If this is a dream, I don't want to wake up." But as they learned the proper techniques for commercial window cleaning, Both brothers couldn't help but wonder what awaited them at James's home. Would his wife really accept them? Or would this turn out to be just another temporary stop in their journey? Only time would tell, but for now they were determined to make the most of this unexpected opportunity. Victoria spent the entire afternoon pacing through her house, directing Martha, the housekeeper, in preparing the guest rooms, while simultaneously fighting her own mounting anxiety. She had chosen the rooms on the 3rd floor, comfortable but safely distant from the master suite on the 2nd floor. Each room had been meticulously cleaned, aired, and furnished with fresh linens in neutral tones. "Martha, please make sure there are extra blankets in both rooms," Victoria instructed, adjusting a pillow for the 4th time. "And toiletries. Did we put toiletries in both bathrooms?" "Yes, Mrs. Bennet," Martha replied patiently. "Everything's been prepared, just as you asked. Fresh towels, soap, toothbrushes, everything they might need." Victoria nodded absently, her hand instinctively reaching for her pearl necklace. She had changed outfits 3 times, finally settling on a casual but elegant cream cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, an outfit that suggested approachability while maintaining appropriate authority. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her freeze. Martha touched her arm gently. "Would you like me to greet them, Mrs. Bennet?" "No," Victoria said, squaring her shoulders. "No, I should do it myself." But she remained rooted to the spot, listening to the sound of car doors closing, of voices in the entrance hall below. "Victoria," James's voice called up the stairs. "We're home." Taking a deep breath, Victoria descended the grand staircase, her hand trailing along the polished banister. The sight that greeted her in the entrance hall made her pause mid-step. Standing beside James were 2 boys who looked nothing like the street urchins she had imagined. Dressed in clean company uniforms, their blonde hair neatly combed, they could have passed for any ordinary teenagers, if not for the wariness in their matching blue eyes. "Victoria, this is Oliver and Arthur Hughes," James said, his voice warm with pride. "Boys, this is my wife, Victoria." The twins stood perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might break the spell of the moment. Victoria descended the remaining stairs, forcing a smile onto her face. "Welcome to our home," she said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennet," they replied in unison, then glanced at each other, embarrassed by the synchronization. An awkward silence fell over the group until James clapped his hands together. "Well, why don't we show you to your rooms? You must be tired after your first day of work." Victoria watched as James led the boys upstairs, noticing how they stayed close together, their shoulders nearly touching. Their footsteps were unnaturally quiet on the carpeted stairs, as if they were trying to leave no trace of their presence. "Martha has prepared dinner," Victoria called after them. "It will be served in an hour in the dining room." In their respective rooms, the twins stood in awe of their surroundings. Each room was larger than any bedroom they'd ever had, with views over the manicured garden below. They had their own ensuite bathrooms, desk areas, and built-in wardrobes that Martha had already stocked with their new clothes. "Take your time to settle in," James told them. "Dinner's at 7. Martha will come up to show you the way to the dining room." Left alone, Oliver and Arthur immediately gravitated to each other's rooms, unable to bear even this small separation. They sat on Oliver's bed, still in their work uniforms, trying to process the dramatic turn their lives had taken. "It doesn't feel real," Arthur whispered, running his hand over the soft duvet. "Mrs. Bennet doesn't want us here," Oliver observed quietly. "Did you see how she looked at us?" "Can you blame her?" Arthur replied. "We're not exactly what people like her are used to." Meanwhile, downstairs in the kitchen, Victoria was interrogating James about his day with the boys. "Are you sure about this, James? They seem very quiet." James smiled knowingly. "They're scared, love. Wouldn't you be? Their whole world has changed in the span of 2 days. But they're clean, healthy. The company doctor checked them. Dr. Stevens gave them both a clean bill of health aside from slight undernourishment. They're good kids, Victoria. They just need time to adjust." "We all do." Victoria busied herself arranging flowers in a vase, needing something to do with her hands. "I've enrolled them in St. Matthew's Academy," she said suddenly. James looked up in surprise. "The private school? Well, we can hardly send them to the local comprehensive, can we? Besides, I'm on the board of governors. They'll make allowances for their unusual circumstances." A slow smile spread across James's face. "You're trying, aren't you?" Victoria shot him a look. They're here, aren't they? Now, should we have dinner in the formal dining room or the breakfast room? I don't want to overwhelm them, but I also don't want them to think we're being overly casual. The breakfast room, James decided. Let's save the formal dining room for when they're more settled. Upstairs, the twins had finally changed into their new casual clothes, jeans and soft jumpers that still had the shop tags attached. They stood before the mirror in Oliver's room, hardly recognizing themselves. We look like different people, Arthur mused, touching his reflection. We're still us, Oliver insisted. We just look cleaner. A gentle knock at the door made them both jump. Martha's kind face appeared. Dinner is ready, boys. Shall I show you the way? They followed her through the house's winding corridors, trying to memorize the route. The breakfast room, despite being the casual option, was still grander than any room they'd eaten in before. Our table that could comfortably seat 8 was set for 4, with more pieces of silverware than the twins had ever seen. Victoria and James were already seated, and the boys hesitated in the doorway until James waved them in. Come on, sit down. Martha's made her famous shepherd's pie. The twins sat together on one side of the table, their movements careful and coordinated. Victoria noticed how they watched her first, copying her movements as she unfolded her napkin and placed it in her lap. So, she said, trying to break the tension, James tells me you did well in your first day of training. Yes, ma'am, Arthur replied softly. Mr. Johnson was very helpful. Please call me Victoria, she said, though the words felt strange on her tongue. We're going to be living together after all. The boys nodded but said nothing, clearly unconvinced. As Martha served the shepherd's pie, Victoria couldn't help but notice how the twins waited until everyone else had started eating before picking up their own forks, how they took small, careful bites despite their obvious hunger. They were trying so hard to be perfect, she realized with a sudden pang of understanding. They were terrified of making a mistake, of giving her a reason to send them away. The realization made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. I've arranged for you both to start at St. Matthew's Academy next week, she found herself saying. It's an excellent school. James and I believe education should be a priority. The twins' forks paused midway to their mouths. School? Oliver asked, the first word he'd spoken since sitting down. Yes, Victoria continued, warming to the subject. They have an excellent academic program and their sports facilities are outstanding. You'll need uniforms, of course, and supplies, but we'll take care of all that tomorrow. James reached across the table and squeezed her hand, his eyes shining with pride and gratitude. Victoria squeezed back, surprising herself with how natural the gesture felt. The rest of dinner passed in relative quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, less tense, more thoughtful. As Martha cleared the plates, Victoria noticed both boys stifling yawns. Perhaps an early night, she suggested. You've had quite a day. The twins nodded gratefully and James stood to escort them back to their rooms. As they left the breakfast room, Victoria heard Oliver whisper to his brother, Did she say sports facilities? For the first time since James had announced his plans to bring street children into their home, Victoria felt a small spark of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this crazy experiment might work after all. The morning of their first day at St. Matthew's Academy dawned crisp and clear. Oliver and Arthur stood before their respective mirrors, adjusting their school uniforms with trembling fingers. The navy blazers with the school's crest, crisp white shirts, striped ties and grey trousers felt like costumes, as if they were playing dress-up in someone else's life. Victoria had taken them shopping for uniforms over the weekend, an experience that had left all parties exhausted and slightly shell-shocked. The twins had never seen so many different types of shirts, or understood why they needed special shoes for physical education, or why their socks had to be a specific shade of grey. Stop fidgeting with your tie, Victoria called out as she passed Oliver's open door. She paused, then stepped into the room, her expression softening. Here, let me help. Oliver stood stock still as Victoria adjusted his tie with practiced movements. James could never get his tie straight either when we first met, she said, surprising herself with the personal admission. There. Perfect. Arthur appeared in the doorway, his own tie slightly askew. Without a word, Victoria gestured him over and fixed his as well. Remember, the car will pick you up at 3:30 sharp. James has arranged for a driver to take you to and from school until you're comfortable with the route. The boys nodded, shouldering their new leather book bags, another of Victoria's purchases. She had insisted on the finest quality, arguing that cheap bags wouldn't last the school year. The twins had watched in amazement as she spent more on 2 school bags than they used to make in a month on the streets. Breakfast was a quiet affair, with James already gone to an early meeting. Victoria supervised as Martha packed their lunches into sophisticated bento boxes, another novelty that had appeared over the weekend. "The headmaster, Mr. Blackwood, knows your situation," Victoria said as they prepared to leave. "Not the details, of course, but enough to understand that you might need additional support at first. Don't hesitate to ask for help if you need it." The car ride to school was silent, both boys watching through the windows as London's affluent neighborhoods rolled past. Matthew's Academy appeared around a corner, its Gothic architecture and manicured grounds looking more like a small university than a school. "Good luck," Victoria said as they pulled up to the gates. "Remember what we practiced. Straight to the headmaster's office, then to our homeroom classes," Arthur finished. "We remember Mrs. Victoria." She watched them walk through the gates, their matching blonde heads close together as they navigated the sea of students in identical uniforms. For a moment, they looked so young and vulnerable that Victoria had to resist the urge to call them back to the car. Inside the school, Oliver and Arthur felt like they had stepped onto another planet. Everything gleamed with privilege and tradition, from the wood-paneled walls to the oil paintings of distinguished alumni. Students moved through the corridors with easy confidence, their voices echoing off the high ceilings. The headmaster's office was exactly where Victoria had shown them during their weekend visit. Mr. Blackwood, a tall man with silver hair and kind eyes, greeted them warmly. "Are the Hughes brothers," he said, rising from behind his massive desk. "Welcome to St. Matthew's. Mrs. Bennet has spoken highly of you both." The twins exchanged surprised glances at this information as Mr. Blackwood reviewed their class schedules. "You'll be in separate classes for most subjects," he explained, "but you'll share physical education and lunch period. We find it helps twins develop their individual strengths while maintaining their connection." Oliver felt Arthur tense beside him at the mention of separation, but neither boy protested. They had promised James and Victoria they would try their best to adapt to this new life. Their respective homeroom teachers were waiting to escort them to their classes. Mrs. Thompson, who would be teaching Oliver, had a no-nonsense manner that reminded him slightly of their grandmother. Mr. Peters, Arthur's teacher, was younger and seemed slightly nervous. "Right then, Mr. Blackwood said, standing. "Off you go. Remember, my door is always open if you need anything." The brothers shared one last look before following their teachers in opposite directions. Oliver found himself in a classroom full of curious faces, all turning to stare as Mrs. Thompson introduced him. "Class, this is Oliver Hughes. He's joining us for the remainder of the year. I trust you'll all make him feel welcome." Oliver slid into an empty desk near the back, acutely aware of the whispers and stares. The boy next to him, a lanky redhead with freckles, leaned over. "I'm Samuel," he whispered, "but everyone calls me Sam. Want to share my textbook until you get yours?" Meanwhile, Arthur was having a similar experience in his classroom, though Mr. Peters' introduction was more awkward. "We have a new student," he announced, gesturing vaguely at Arthur. "Arthur Hughes. There's an empty seat by the window." The girl in front of Arthur's assigned seat turned around as he sat down. She had dark skin and bright eyes that sparkled with intelligence. "I'm Priya," she said with a friendly smile. "So you're one of the twins everyone's talking about, aren't you?" Arthur's heart sank. "Everyone's talking about us?" Priya rolled her eyes. "It's St. Matthew's. Everyone talks about everything. Don't worry, they'll find something new to gossip about by next week." The morning passed in a blur of new experiences. Both boys found themselves struggling to keep up with lessons that assumed years of private education. Oliver discovered he had a natural aptitude for mathematics, but was hopelessly lost in French class. Arthur showed unexpected talent in English literature, but struggled with the complex scientific terminology in biology. At lunch, they reunited in the dining hall, gravitating toward each other like magnets. Sam and Priya joined them, seeming to understand instinctively that the twins needed friendly faces. "The food here is actually decent," Sam said, attacking his shepherd's pie with enthusiasm. "It's nothing like my old school where the mashed potatoes could double as cement." "Do you play any sports?" Priya asked, noting how both boys had been eyeing the football pitch visible through the dining hall windows. "We used to," Oliver replied carefully. Before we moved to London," Arthur finished smoothly, the lie coming easily after years of practice. "Brilliant," Sam exclaimed. "Football tryouts are next week. You should both come. We need new players for the junior team." The afternoon brought physical education, the one class they shared. The twins found themselves in the school's state-of-the-art gymnasium, surrounded by equipment they had only seen on television. "Hughes 1 and Hughes 2, the PE teacher, Mr. Bradley, called out. "Let's see what you can do." To everyone's surprise, including their own, years of street survival had left them in excellent physical condition. They outran their classmates in sprints, showed remarkable agility in gymnastics, and demonstrated an almost telepathic connection during team sports. "Natural athletes," Mr. Bradley commented approvingly. "You'll both try out for teams, of course." By the end of the day, Oliver and Arthur were mentally exhausted, but oddly exhilarated. They found the car waiting exactly where Victoria had said it would be and climbed in with relief. "How was it?" the driver asked kindly. The twins looked at each other, having one of their silent conversations. "Different," Oliver finally said. "But not bad," Arthur added. As they drove home, both boys clutched their homework assignments and thought about Sam and Priya, about football tryouts and gymnastics equipment, about the way Victoria had fixed their ties that morning. Perhaps, they thought, they could learn to navigate this new world after all. But neither of them noticed the group of older boys watching their departure from the school gates, their expressions calculating as they observed the newest additions to St. Matthew's Academy. 2 weeks into their new life, Oliver and Arthur were beginning to establish a routine. Each morning, Victoria would check their uniforms before breakfast, making minor adjustments that were becoming less necessary as the boys learned to tie their ties properly. James would often join them for breakfast, peppering them with questions about their classes and offering encouragement. But this particular morning, something was different. Victoria noticed it first, a tension in Oliver's shoulders, a wariness in Arthur's eyes that reminded her of their earliest days in the house. "Is everything all right?" she asked, watching as Oliver pushed his porridge around his bowl without eating. "Fine," both boys answered simultaneously, a sure sign that something was wrong. James looked up from his newspaper, exchanging a glance with Victoria. Before either could press further, the twins quickly finished their breakfast and headed for the door, claiming they didn't want to be late. The truth was, trouble had been brewing at St. Matthew's. Sebastian Blackwood, the headmaster's son and a sixth former, had taken an interest in the twins that was far from friendly. It had started with subtle comments in the corridors, remarks about charity cases and scholarship students, though the twins were neither. "Just ignore them," Priya had advised during lunch the previous day, after Sebastian and his friends had made a show of moving to a different table when the twins sat down. "Sebastian's just angry because his father talks about you two at home." "What do you mean?" Arthur had asked, picking at his lunch. "Apparently, Mr. Blackwood keeps telling Sebastian he could learn something from you both, about determination and resilience or something like that," Sam explained. "Sebastian doesn't like being compared to anyone, especially not street rats," Oliver had finished bitterly. Now, as they arrived at school, the twins immediately noticed Sebastian and his friends lounging by the entrance. They tried to slip past unnoticed, but Sebastian's voice rang out across the courtyard. "Well, if it isn't the charity cases, tell me, do the Bennets make you use the servants' entrance at home?" Arthur grabbed Oliver's arm, feeling his brother tense. "Don't," he whispered. "Remember what James said. We have to be smarter than them." They hurried inside, Sebastian's laughter following them down the corridor, but as they separated for their morning classes, neither brother could shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. In Oliver's mathematics class, he found himself paired with Sebastian's girlfriend, Charlotte, for a group assignment. She spent the entire lesson making snide comments just loud enough for nearby students to hear. "I heard they found them cleaning car windows at traffic lights," she whispered to a friend. "Can you imagine? I wouldn't let someone like that touch my car, let alone live in my house." Oliver focused on his equations, remembering Victoria's words from their first weekend. "Your intelligence is your armor. Use it." Meanwhile, Arthur was excelling in English literature, much to Sebastian's growing irritation. When Arthur's essay on Great Expectations received the highest mark in the class, Sebastian cornered him after the lesson. "Think you're clever, do you?" Sebastian sneered, backing Arthur against the lockers. "Just because you can write about Pip doesn't mean you belong here. You and your brother are just like him, common little criminals playing at being gentlemen." "Leave him alone," Priya's voice cut through the tension. She stood at the end of the corridor, her phone raised. "Unless you want me to show your father this video of you harassing a younger student?" Sebastian backed away, his face red with anger. "This isn't over," he muttered, before stalking off. At lunch, the twins huddled at their usual table with Sam and Priya, discussing the morning's events in low voices. "You should tell someone," Sam insisted. "Mr. Blackwood or your parents, I mean, the Bennets." "They're not our parents," Oliver said sharply, "and we can handle this ourselves." "Besides," Arthur added, "telling would only make it worse. We've dealt with worse things than Sebastian Blackwood." But when they arrived home that afternoon, they found an unexpected ally in Victoria. She was waiting in the kitchen with Martha, who was preparing afternoon tea. "Mr. Blackwood called," Victoria said without preamble. "He mentioned there might be some social adjustment issues." The twins exchanged alarmed looks, but Victoria continued before they could speak. "I told him we were handling it at home, but I need to know the truth. Are you being bullied?" "We're fine," Oliver insisted, but Victoria held up a hand. "When I married James," she said, surprising them with this personal revelation, "certain people made our lives very difficult. They thought he wasn't good enough for me, that he didn't belong in our social circle. Do you know what James did?" The twins shook their heads. "He proved them wrong. Not by fighting or complaining, but by being better than they could ever be. He showed them that true worth isn't about where you come from, but who you choose to become." She stood, smoothing her skirt with practiced elegance. "Now, I understand you have football tryouts tomorrow." "Yes," Arthur confirmed, thrown by the sudden change of subject. "But Sebastian's on the team." "Then you'll just have to be better than him, won't you?" Victoria said simply. "Martha, please make sure the boys have a proper breakfast tomorrow. They'll need their energy." As she left the kitchen, the twins stared after her in amazement. Martha chuckled at their expressions. "Mrs. Bennet isn't always good at showing it," she said, placing cookies on a plate. "But she's on your side, boys. We all are." That evening, as James helped them with their mathematics homework, he seemed to sense their preoccupation. "You know," he said casually, "when I was starting out in business, I faced a lot of prejudice. People like Sebastian and his friends, they're everywhere. But do you know what they hate most?" "What?" the twins asked in unison. "Success. Every time you excel, every time you rise above their pettiness, it drives them mad. So tomorrow at those tryouts, show them exactly what you're capable of." The twins went to bed that night with renewed determination. As they lay in their separate rooms, they thought about Victoria's words, about James's encouragement, about Sam and Priya's friendship. "Ollie," Arthur called through their shared wall. "Yeah? We're going to show them, aren't we?" "Yeah," Oliver replied, a smile in his voice. "We are." Neither brother slept much that night, but for the first time since Sebastian's harassment began, they weren't afraid. Tomorrow would be their chance to prove themselves, not just to Sebastian and his friends, but to everyone who had ever doubted them. And as they finally drifted off to sleep, they found themselves looking forward to it. The morning of the football tryouts dawned cold and misty. Victoria surprised everyone by appearing at breakfast in casual clothes, designer athleisure wear, but still a dramatic departure from her usual elegant attire. "I've cleared my schedule for the morning," she announced, catching the twins' shocked expressions. "I thought I might come watch the tryouts if you don't mind." Oliver and Arthur exchanged glances, then looked at James, who was trying to hide his smile behind his coffee cup. "You want to watch us play football?" Arthur asked carefully. "Well, if I'm going to be attending your matches, I should understand the game properly, shouldn't I?" Victoria replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Martha had outdone herself with breakfast: protein-rich eggs, whole-grain toast, fresh fruit, and smoothies that she insisted would give them energy. As the twins ate, Victoria fussed over their football kit, making sure everything was properly labeled with their names. "I've never seen you in trainers before," Oliver observed, watching Victoria adjust her ponytail. "There's a lot you don't know about me yet," she replied with a slight smile. "For instance, I was quite the athlete myself at school. Field hockey was my sport. The ride to school was different that morning. Instead of their usual driver, James had arranged his schedule to drive them himself, with Victoria in the passenger seat. The twins sat in the back, their football boots cleaned to perfection, Victoria's insistence, their hearts pounding with anticipation. "Remember," James said as they pulled up to the school, "it's not about them. It's about you showing what you can do." The school's football pitch was already busy with activity when they arrived. Sebastian and his friends were there, along with Mr. Bradley and several other PE teachers. Sam was warming up near the goalposts, and Priya sat in the stands with a few other students. "Mrs. Bennett," Mr. Bradley called out in surprise, seeing Victoria approach the stands. "This is unexpected. I thought it was time I took a more active interest in school sports," Victoria replied smoothly, settling herself on the bleachers with more grace than should have been possible on the metal seats. The tryouts began with basic drills, dribbling, passing, shooting. The twins' natural athleticism shone through, their years of street survival having honed their speed and agility. But it was their connection that drew gasps from the spectators. Without seeming to look at each other, they always knew where the other would be, anticipating each other's moves with uncanny precision. "They're quite good," Victoria murmured to Priya, who had joined her in the stands. "They're better than good," Priya replied. "Look at Sebastian's face." Indeed, Sebastian was growing increasingly red with frustration as the twins outperformed him in drill after drill. When it came time for the practice match, he immediately volunteered to be on the opposing team. "Hughes and Hughes, you're with me," Mr. Bradley announced, placing the twins on the same team. "Let's see what you can do in a real game situation." The match started intensely, with Sebastian immediately targeting Oliver with aggressive tackles. But the twins had played rougher games on concrete streets with makeshift balls. They moved like water around his attempts to block them, using their smaller size to their advantage. The defining moment came near the end of the match. Arthur had the ball, with Sebastian bearing down on him hard. Instead of trying to dribble past, Arthur made a seemingly blind pass behind him, directly into Oliver's path as he ran from the opposite direction. Oliver caught the pass perfectly and sent the ball soaring into the top corner of the goal. The small crowd erupted in cheers. Victoria found herself on her feet, clapping enthusiastically before remembering herself and sitting down with as much dignity as she could muster. But her eyes were shining with pride. "Well," Mr. Bradley said as the match ended, "I think it's clear we have some excellent new talent for the team. Hughes and Hughes, welcome aboard. Sebastian, a word please about appropriate tackle intensity during practice." As the crowd dispersed, the twins found themselves surrounded by their teammates, receiving congratulations and friendly pats on the back. Sebastian stormed off toward the changing rooms, his friends trailing behind him uncertainly. "That was quite impressive," Victoria said as they approached her. To their astonishment, she pulled 2 bottles of sports drink from her designer bag. "Martha insisted you need to replenish your electrolytes, whatever those are." "You stayed for the whole thing," Arthur said wonderingly, accepting the drink. "Of course I did. So I'm hardly going to leave halfway through, am I?" She paused, then added more softly, "Besides, I wouldn't have wanted to miss that goal. It was quite spectacular." "Does this mean you'll come to our matches?" Oliver asked, trying to sound casual, but unable to hide the hope in his voice. "Well, I can't very well be the only member of the Parents' Association who doesn't support the team, can I?" Victoria replied. Then, seeing their confused looks, she added, "Oh, did I forget to mention? I joined the Parents' Association this morning. Somebody needs to advocate for updating these dreadful facilities." On the drive home, James couldn't stop grinning. "I hear it was quite a show," he said. "Victoria sent me a video of that last goal." "You recorded it?" the twins asked in unison, turning to stare at Victoria. "Martha asked me to," she said primly. She was very disappointed she couldn't be here herself. But later that evening, as the twins were doing their homework in the study, they overheard Victoria showing the video to Martha in the kitchen, her voice filled with unmistakable pride as she described every detail of the match. "Did you see that pass?" they heard her say. "Arthur didn't even look, he just knew Oliver would be there. And Oliver's shot, perfect form, just perfect. Mr. Bradley says they're naturals." "They're good boys," Martha replied warmly. "You're doing well with them, Mrs. Bennett." There was a pause before Victoria replied, so softly the twins almost missed it. They make it easy to do well by them. That night, as they lay in their beds, the twins reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. They had gone from cleaning windscreens to scoring goals, from avoiding authority figures to having a... What was Victoria to them now? "Ollie?" Arthur called through their wall. "Yeah? Did you see her cheering when you scored?" "Yeah." "Did you see her arguing with the referee when he called that foul on you?" They both laughed softly, remembering Victoria's indignant, "That was clearly a clean tackle," that had drawn startled looks from everyone nearby. "She's different than we thought," Arthur said after a moment. "Yeah," Oliver agreed. "She is." And somewhere in the house, Victoria was already planning her outfit for their first proper match, while simultaneously researching football rules and the best brands of football boots. Because if she was going to be a football mum, and the thought no longer filled her with dread, she was going to do it properly. The day everything changed started like any other. Victoria was preparing for an important charity luncheon, one she had been planning for months. She stood before her mirror, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, reaching for her signature pearl necklace, only to find the velvet box empty. "James?" she called out, her voice tight with concern. "Have you seen my grandmother's pearls?" James appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work. "Aren't they in their usual place?" "No," Victoria replied, her hand trembling slightly as she opened other jewelry boxes. "I always keep them in this box." Always. The pearls weren't just any necklace, they were a family heirloom, passed down through 4 generations of Victoria's family. She had worn them at her wedding, and they had become her signature piece at every important social event. "Perhaps Martha moved them while cleaning," James suggested, but Victoria was already shaking her head. "Martha knows never to touch the pearls. I'm the only one who handles them." She paused, her face paling. "The only one who should have access to this room." James's expression darkened as he realized what she was implying. "Victoria, you can't be serious." "I don't want to believe it either, James, but who else could have taken them? The boys have been in and out of our room several times this week, helping Martha with the laundry, bringing up your files." "Stop," James said firmly. "We are not going to jump to conclusions. Those boys have given us no reason to doubt them." But Victoria was already moving toward the door. "I need to know, James. I need to be sure." Before James could stop her, Victoria was climbing the stairs to the 3rd floor. The twins were in their rooms, preparing for school. She found Oliver first, knocking briefly before entering. "Oliver," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need to ask you something important." Something in her tone made Oliver tense. In the next room, Arthur appeared in their shared doorway, drawn by the unusual morning interruption. "My pearl necklace is missing," Victoria continued, watching their faces carefully. "My grandmother's pearls. They're very valuable, but more importantly, they're irreplaceable. If either of you has taken them for any reason, I need to know now." The silence that followed was deafening. The twins stared at her, their faces shifting from confusion to hurt to something harder, more familiar, the protective mask they had worn when they first arrived. "You think we stole from you?" Oliver's voice was barely above a whisper. "No," James said firmly from the doorway. "We don't think that. We're just asking if you've seen them." "Why ask us specifically?" Arthur demanded. "Why not ask Martha, or the gardener, or any of the other staff?" "Because they've been with us for years," Victoria replied, then immediately regretted her words as she saw the pain flash across the twins' faces. "And we're just street rats you took in," Oliver said, his voice cold. "Of course we'd be the first suspects." "That's not what I meant," Victoria protested. But the damage was done. "We didn't take your necklace," Arthur said, moving to stand beside his brother. "We haven't touched any of your things." "We're not thieves." "Boys, please," James started, but Oliver cut him off. "We trusted you," he said, looking directly at Victoria. We thought you were starting to trust us too." Victoria felt sick. The hurt in their eyes, the way they stood together, defensive and wounded, it was like watching all their progress of the past months crumble in an instant. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I shouldn't have." But the twins were already moving, grabbing their school bags. They brushed past her and James, their footsteps quick and quiet on the stairs, still so quiet even after all this time. "Let them go to school," James said as Victoria made to follow them. "Give them time to cool off. We'll talk this evening." But when evening came, the twins didn't return home. The school called to report their absence from afternoon classes. Their phones went straight to voicemail. As the hours passed, panic set in. Victoria paced the kitchen, her charity luncheon long forgotten. "This is all my fault," she said, twisting her hands together. "I drove them away. James, what if they're back on the streets? What if something happens to them?" James was on the phone with the police filing a missing persons report. Martha was crying quietly by the stove, blaming herself for not checking on them during lunch break. As darkness fell, Victoria found herself in Oliver's room, looking at the small signs of the life he and Arthur had built here. Homework spread across the desk, football kit hung neatly in the wardrobe, her influence, a photo of their grandmother on the bedside table. Something caught her eye, a glint of white under the radiator. She knelt down, reaching beneath it, and her fingers touched something smooth and cool, her pearl necklace. It had fallen, probably while she was helping Martha change the curtains the previous week. It had rolled under the radiator, out of sight. The twins hadn't taken it. They had never even known it was there. Victoria sat on Oliver's bed, clutching the pearls, and finally allowed herself to cry. She cried for her own prejudice, for the trust she had broken, for the pain she had caused two boys who had already endured so much. "James!" she called out, her voice breaking. "James, I found them!" The pearls. They were here all along. But as James came running up the stairs, they both knew finding the necklace was only the first step. The harder task would be finding the twins and convincing them to come home, if they still considered it home at all. "We have to find them," Victoria said, standing up with new determination. "I have to make this right." James nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I'll call the police back, let them know about the necklace. You call Mr. Blackwood?" The boys might have gone somewhere near the school. As they mobilized their search, Victoria couldn't stop thinking about the twins' faces when she had accused them. Not with words, perhaps, but with suspicion, which was just as damaging. She had betrayed their trust, fallen back on her old prejudices at the first test. "Please be safe," she whispered, clutching the pearls that had caused so much pain. "Please let us find you." For the first time since the twins had entered their lives, Victoria realized that she wasn't worried about her reputation or what people would think. She was worried about two boys who had become, somehow, essential parts of her world. Two boys she needed to bring home. The search for the twins continued well into the night. Victoria and James had split up, each taking different areas of London where the boys might have gone. The police were searching too, but Victoria couldn't just sit at home and wait. She knew this was her mistake to fix. She sat in the back of her car, directing her driver through the streets of East London, where the twins had once cleaned windscreens. Every time she saw a flash of blonde hair or a pair of teenagers, her heart would leap, only to crash again when it wasn't them. "Mrs. Bennett," her driver said gently. "Perhaps we should head back, it's getting late." "No," Victoria replied firmly. "Keep driving. They're out here somewhere." Her phone buzzed. A message from James. No luck at their old foster homes or any of the shelters he'd checked. Victoria closed her eyes, trying to think. Where would they go? What had she missed? Then she remembered a conversation from weeks ago, something about a special place they used to go with their grandmother. She'd mentioned it during one of their quiet Sunday breakfasts, when the boys had started opening up more. "The London Eye," Victoria said suddenly. Their grandmother used to take them there on special occasions. They said they could see the whole city from up there. The driver nodded and changed direction. Even though the London Eye would be closed at this hour, Victoria had a feeling about the area around it. As they approached the South Bank, she spotted two familiar figures huddled on a bench, their school uniforms still pristine despite everything. Some habits, she realized with a pang, were hard to break. "Stop here," she instructed the driver. "Wait for us." Victoria approached slowly, her heels clicking on the pavement. The twins looked up at the sound, their faces guarded. They were holding hands, just as they had been that first day at the traffic lights. "How did you find us?" Oliver asked, his voice hoarse. "I remembered what you told me about your grandmother bringing you here," Victoria replied, stopping a few feet away. "May I sit?" The boys shifted slightly, making room on the bench. Victoria sat carefully, noticing how they tensed at her proximity. "I found the pearls," she said quietly. "They had fallen under the radiator in Oliver's room, probably when we were changing the curtains last week." She pulled the necklace from her pocket, the pearls gleaming in the streetlight. I jumped to conclusions. I let old prejudices cloud my judgment, and I hurt you both terribly. You didn't trust us, Arthur said, his voice small. After everything, no, I didn't. And that says far more about me than it does about you. Victoria took a deep breath. When I was younger, my mother used to tell me that these pearls represented our family's legacy, generations of proper breeding and social standing. I've spent my whole life trying to live up to what these pearls represent. She looked down at the necklace in her hands. But today I realized something. These pearls, this legacy I've been so proud of, it made me forget the most important legacy my mother ever gave me, the ability to admit when I'm wrong and to try to make it right. Is that why you came looking for us? Oliver asked. To make it right? No, Victoria replied honestly. I came looking for you because I was terrified something would happen to you, because the thought of you out here, alone and hurt because of my actions, was unbearable. Because, she paused, realizing the truth as she said it, because you're my boys now, whether any of us planned it that way or not. The twins stared at her, startled by the emotion in her voice. We're not really yours, Arthur said, but his voice wavered. Perhaps not legally, Victoria agreed. But try telling that to my heart when I realized you were missing. Or to Martha, who's stress-baking enough cookies to feed an army because she's so worried. Or to James, who's still out there searching every place he can think of. She held out the pearl necklace. These pearls? They're just things. Beautiful things with history, yes, but still just things. But you two, you're so much more important than any necklace. Oliver reached out hesitantly and touched one of the pearls. We really didn't take them. I know, Victoria said, her voice cracking. I know that now, and I'm so sorry I ever doubted you. What happens now? Arthur asked, and Victoria could hear the real question beneath. Would things go back to the way they were before? Now, if you're willing to give me another chance, we go home. And tomorrow we start rebuilding the trust I broke. She stood and held out her hands to them. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes again, but I can promise I'll try to be better, to be worthy of the trust you placed in me. The twins looked at each other, having one of their silent conversations. Then, slowly, they stood up. We left our homework at home, Arthur said quietly. And we missed football practice, Oliver added. Victoria felt hope bloom in her chest. We'll sort it all out, she promised, together. They walked back to the car, the twins still maintaining a slight distance but no longer running away. As they drove home, Victoria sent a quick text to James. Found them. Coming home. The house was blazing with lights when they arrived. James was waiting at the door and Martha stood in the kitchen doorway, wringing her apron in her hands. Without a word, both boys found themselves enveloped in a group hug, with Martha crying openly and James trying to pretend he wasn't. Don't you ever scare us like that again, James said gruffly. I'm so sorry, boys, Martha sobbed. I should have checked on you at lunch. We're okay, Arthur assured her. We just needed time to think. And we're sorry too, Oliver added, looking at Victoria, for running away instead of talking. Victoria shook her head. No apologies needed. Not from you. That night, as the twins settled back into their rooms, Victoria stood in their doorway, watching them unpack their school bags. I've been thinking, she said. Those pearls have been passed down through generations of my family's women. Perhaps it's time they had a new purpose, a symbol not of social standing but of trust being rebuilt. Would you help me decide what that might look like? The twins looked at her, really looked at her, and saw what she was offering. Not just forgiveness, but a place in her legacy. We'd like that, they said together. As Victoria walked back to her room, she heard their quiet voices through the wall, talking as they always did before sleep. But this time, they weren't planning an escape. They were planning to stay. And somehow that meant more than all the pearls in the world. 3 months had passed since the incident with the pearls, and autumn had given way to winter. The Bennett household had changed in subtle but significant ways. Victoria's pearl necklace now hung in a custom-made display case in the living room, alongside photographs of the twins' first football match, their school awards, and their grandmother. It had become a symbol not of status, but of growth and trust rebuilt. On this particular morning, Victoria was unusually nervous at breakfast. She kept glancing at James, who seemed equally anxious beneath his calm exterior. The twins noticed the tension but said nothing. having learned that sometimes adults needed time to find their words. "Boys," Victoria finally said, setting down her teacup with slightly shaking hands. "James and I would like to discuss something important with you." Oliver and Arthur straightened in their chairs, exchanging quick glances. Despite the months of progress, old instincts died hard. "You're not in trouble," James added quickly, seeing their concern. "Quite the opposite, actually." Victoria reached for the folder she had placed beside her chair. "As you know, these past months have been transformative for all of us. The incident with the pearls, while painful, helped us realize something important. We're a family," James continued. "Not in the traditional sense, perhaps, but in all the ways that matter." The twins sat very still, hardly daring to breathe. Victoria opened the folder and pulled out several official-looking documents. "These are adoption papers," she said softly, "if you want them to be." The kitchen fell silent. Even Martha, who had been pretending to busy herself with the dishes, stopped moving. "You want to adopt us?" Arthur's voice was barely a whisper. "Only if you want us to," James assured them. "There's no pressure. You can take time to think about it." "But we want you to know," Victoria added, her voice stronger now, "that you already are our sons in our hearts." This would just make it official. Oliver reached for the papers with trembling hands. "But what about our last name and our grandmother's memory?" "You can keep your last name if you want to," Victoria said, "or you can take ours, or both. As for your grandmother..." She stood and walked to a cabinet, returning with a small box. "We thought about that too." Inside the box were 2 identical tie pins, each set with a single pearl. "These are from my necklace," Victoria explained. "I had them made for you. This way you can carry a piece of both families with you, your grandmother's memory and our future together." The twins stared at the tie pins, then at the adoption papers, then at each other. Their eyes filled with tears they didn't try to hide. "What would we call you?" Arthur asked hesitantly. "Whatever feels right to you," James replied. "We're not trying to replace your parents or your grandmother. We're just offering to add to your family, not subtract from it." Victoria held her breath, watching the silent communication between the twins. After what felt like an eternity, Oliver spoke. Could we call you Mum and Dad? Not right away, maybe, but someday?" Victoria's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes," she managed to say. "Yes, whenever you're ready." "Then yes," both boys said simultaneously. "We want to be Bennetts." What followed was a blur of hugs and tears, with Martha sobbing happily in the background and James trying to maintain his composure while failing completely. Victoria held her boys, officially her boys now, and marveled at how far they had all come. "There's one more thing," James said once everyone had calmed down somewhat. "We've been thinking about ways to honor your grandmother's memory and help other children like you." He pulled out another set of documents. "We're establishing the Margaret Hughes Foundation, named after your grandmother. It will provide support and opportunities for children in the foster system and those living on the streets. And we'd like you both to be part of it," Victoria added. "Not now, but in the future. You understand better than anyone what these children need." The twins looked at each other, then at their new parents. "Can we help plan it?" Oliver asked. "We have ideas. We want to make sure the kids have someone who really listens to them," Arthur added, "and keeps families together." "Of course," James said warmly. "It will be a family project." Victoria watched as the twins began excitedly discussing their ideas, their natural compassion shining through. These were her sons now, she thought proudly. These brilliant, resilient, caring boys were her children. Later that evening, as the family sat in the living room reviewing the adoption paperwork, Victoria noticed the twins kept touching their new tie pins, as if reassuring themselves they were real. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "these pearls have been in my family for generations, but I don't think they've ever meant as much as they do now." "Because they're helping build a new family?" Arthur asked. "Because they're helping build the right kind of family," Victoria corrected. "One based on love and trust, not tradition and social standing." As she looked at her family, James helping Oliver with a particularly complex piece of paperwork, Arthur making notes about the foundation, Martha bringing in hot chocolate for everyone, Victoria realized that her mother had been wrong about the pearls. Their true value wasn't in their perfect roundness or their flawless sheen. Their true value was in the way they had helped bring this unlikely family together, in the way they had taught them all about trust, forgiveness, and the real meaning of legacy. 4 years had passed since the day 2 boys cleaning windscreens caught the attention of a passing businessman. The grand ballroom of the Bennett Hotel was filled to capacity for the inaugural gala of the Margaret Hughes Foundation, but all eyes were on the family standing on the stage. Victoria Bennett, elegant as ever in a midnight blue gown, stood proudly beside her husband. The famous pearl necklace had been permanently retired to its display case at home, replaced by a simple pendant containing 2 small pearls, one for each of her sons. James beamed at the crowd, his arm around his wife, while Martha sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. But it was Oliver and Arthur Bennett Hughes who commanded the room's attention. At 18, they had grown into tall, confident young men, their matching blue eyes bright with emotion as they prepared to address the gathered donors and beneficiaries of their grandmother's namesake foundation. 4 years ago, Oliver began, my brother and I stood at a traffic light cleaning windscreens to survive. Today, Arthur continued, we stand before you as proud graduates of St. Matthew's Academy and future social work students at the University of London. The twins shared a smile before Oliver continued, but this isn't just our story. It's the story of every child who needs a chance, who needs someone to see past their circumstances to their potential. The Margaret Hughes Foundation, Arthur explained, isn't just about providing shelter or food, though those are crucial. It's about keeping families together, about providing support before crisis strikes, and about giving children the tools they need to build their own futures. Victoria squeezed James's hand as they listened to their sons speak. She remembered the shy, wary boys they had been, and marveled at the young men they had become. The past 4 years hadn't always been easy. There had been nightmares, adjustments, and moments of doubt, but they had faced each challenge together. Our grandmother used to tell us that every person has 2 families, Oliver said, his voice thick with emotion. The one they're born into and the one they choose. We were blessed to have both. And now, Arthur added, we want to help other children find their chosen families, whether through reunion with their birth families, adoption, or foster care. The Foundation's first initiative was already showing promise. Working with local authorities, they had established a program to keep siblings together in the foster system, inspired by the twins' own experience. They had also created a scholarship program for foster children and those from disadvantaged backgrounds. As the twins concluded their speech, a slideshow began playing behind them. Images of their grandmother filled the screen, followed by photos of their journey, from those first days in the Bennett household to their recent graduation. The final image showed the whole family together at the twins' graduation ceremony, all of them wearing matching tie pins with single pearls. Ladies and gentlemen, James stepped forward, I give you the future of the Margaret Hughes Foundation, my sons Oliver and Arthur Bennett Hughes. The applause was thunderous, but Victoria barely heard it. She was watching her sons embrace each other, then turn to hug her and James. These moments still caught her by surprise sometimes, the easy affection, the unconditional love that had grown between them. Later that evening, as the gala wound down, the family gathered in a quiet corner of the ballroom. Sebastian Blackwood had come to congratulate them, now a changed young man who had learned his own lessons about prejudice and growth. Even his father, the headmaster, had become one of the Foundation's strongest supporters. I have something for you both, Victoria said, pulling out 2 small boxes. Inside each was a key. These are for your rooms at home. The twins looked confused. But we're moving into university accommodation next month, Arthur said. Yes, Victoria smiled. But that doesn't mean you won't need your rooms at home. Some things don't change just because you're growing up. You'll always have a place with us, James added, both as our sons and as the future leaders of this foundation. Oliver and Arthur looked at their keys, then at each other, sharing one of their silent conversations. Finally, Oliver spoke. We know we don't say it often enough, but thank you for everything, for seeing us that day, Dad, for giving us a chance, Mum, for becoming our family. Victoria pulled her sons close, no longer worried about maintaining public composure. Thank you for teaching me what family really means, she whispered. As they drove home that night, Victoria thought about the pearls in their display case at home. They had begun as a symbol of status and tradition, but they had become something far more valuable, a reminder of how love could bridge any divide, how trust could be broken and rebuilt stronger, and how family could be found in the most unexpected places. The twins fell asleep in the car, just as they had so many times after football matches and school events. James carried on a quiet conversation with the driver, and Victoria watched her sleeping boys, remembering the first time they had fallen asleep in their new beds, too afraid then to fully relax. "Full circle," she murmured to herself, touching the pearl pendant at her throat. "What was that, love?" James asked. "We've come full circle," she said, smiling at her husband. "But this is really just the beginning, isn't it?" James reached back and squeezed her hand. "The beginning of something wonderful." And as their car wound its way home through the London streets, passing the very intersection where it had all started, Victoria Bennet said a silent thank you to the pearls that had taught her the true meaning of legacy, to the boys who had taught her the true meaning of family, and to the woman whose memory had brought them all together. Because some endings are really just beginnings in disguise,